and we'll maybe start with introductions. So my name is Kseniya. I use she, her pronouns. So I'm a moderator of this event, and I am education chair of the College Counseling and other educational special interest group of American Group Psychotherapy Association. And Vinny graciously helped me to moderate this event since we had so many people register. So Vinny, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, my name is Vinny Dehili. I'm a grant group coordinator and staff psychologist at the University of South Florida's Counseling Center.
Cool. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention where I work. I'm a staff psychologist at the University of Maryland Counseling Center. I'll say a few words about the purpose of this event. So happy to see so many people here. Welcome everyone who is joining us. So essentially we're all here because no matter how we felt about internet or teletherapy, here we are all doing it. And groups have been such a huge part of college counseling services and such a valuable thing that we've been doing. And I mean, simply put, we want to continue doing it. And I'm sure many people will agree with me. I want to continue sharing the magic of group with my clients, as you know, I've seen how group transformed and touched other people's life, and definitely something that I want us to keep doing. And so as I started thinking about how to make group happen in my center and learning about online groups, I realized there's not a whole lot of information out there, especially for online groups with university students. It's kind of a special population that we have. So I decided to organize this event, and I invited some of the few people in our field who've kind of tried this out and tried putting their groups online with university students, who will share with us today some of their experiences, what it's been like, and what it's been like to try this for the first time. So that's what we're doing. Before our lovely panelists introduce themselves, I want to give you a sense of our agenda. So pretty simple. I'll ask some questions that we've prepared ahead of time to our panelists. I have 8 questions totals, and we'll be doing that until 6:15 p.m. And then from 6:15 p.m. until 7 p.m., it will be time for questions from the audience. So then panelists will answer some of the questions that will be coming from all of you. So as far as questions that we have prepared, they cover 3 areas mainly. So preparation for online groups, some challenges that may occur with online groups, and how interpersonal process works in online environment with university students. All right. Vinny, do you want to talk about how questions will work?
Yeah, so we're going to have all the questions filtered through myself. And so if you go to your chat option, you should be able to select my name from the list. And it asks that you send any questions you have for the panelists to me. We're going to do our best, since there's so many people out here, to draw them into similar themes and try and answer as many questions as we can, tying the common themes together. So if you don't hear your question exactly the way you phrased it, then apologies for that. It's probably just because we're trying to make the most out of the spare time that we have during this panel.
Yes, so as a clarification, the chat, you can only chat with a host, so it's myself or Vinny. So if you have questions, please send them to Vinny, and then he'll then help organize them and kind of put them together, and we'll get them to our panelists. Okay. All right, awesome. Let's see what's next. So as I've already mentioned, this event is being recorded. So it will be available on YouTube, on AGPA's YouTube page. Once I know the link, I will send a link to everybody who's registered, whose emails I have. Okay, so we're about to get going, and I'll let our panelists introduce themselves. So I ask that everybody who is not a panelist, please turn off your videos. We'll do this to help us keep organized. And so if you want to just see the panelists and moderators on your screen, you can click on anybody's video that has the video off, right click, and there's an option to hide non-video participants. And then on your page, you'll only see Vinny, myself, and our 4 panelists. Okay, looks like it's working. Yeah, all right. Okay, super. So we are ready to get going with introductions to our panelists. So from your introductions, please tell us your name and your pronouns, your professional title and where you work, and briefly tell us about your experience with process groups and what your experience been with online groups. And maybe also mention what platform you use to run online groups. And if you forget any of this, not to worry, I'll remind you.
So I can start. My name is Alana Jacobs, pronouns she, her, hers, and I'm a clinical psychologist at University of California, Santa Cruz at their counseling and psych services. So I've been running interpersonal process groups with university students for a little over 2 years and have been doing online groups probably since March, since the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders. So I've actually been loving it. I'm in a Zoom group myself, so I think that gave me a little bit more comfort and confidence with the platform, and so I do use Zoom. That is the platform I've been using. So look forward to talking more about it.
Alana, and I have a clarification question for you. Did you continue your groups that were already established online, or were some of your groups, did you start online?
Good question. I had one grad group that continued. It was a group that existed in person and transitioned online. And then I recruited and started 2 whole new groups completely online.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
I can go. My name is Nate Page. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a staff psychologist and the group coordinator at Carleton College. So about 2,000 students, small liberal arts college in Minnesota. I very much am a process-oriented group leader. So any group that I run eventually becomes process-oriented, no matter, even maybe against my best efforts. So even support groups, we tend to be getting into the here and now a lot. But I do a lot of just understanding self and others groups. And then I actually have not done an online process group with university students, but I have had an online private practice for about 1.5 years and do a lot of online group work with that, including a group for therapists. And so it's an online process-oriented training group for therapists. So I have that experience. And so maybe I have a sense of what you might be experiencing as a therapist joining this, what some of your feelings or thoughts might be, especially as we've all kind of navigated changing into doing online work. And the platform that I have been using for my private practice group work is Regroup Connect, but that closed off this last Friday. So I am searching for what to do next, and I'm probably going to do VC is what I'm considering, but not sold yet.
Nate, and for the groups that you're doing online through your private practice, what population? So I hear there's one consultation groups, but there's also a therapy group. Yeah, and what are participants in who are the participants in those groups? So
therapists, so a process-oriented training group for therapists, which is very much just a process group but it's a training group. And wanting to do one with university students. I've done a few support groups and a number of short-term online trainings.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'll jump in next. I am Shemika Brooks. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a staff psychologist and the group coordinator at Johns Hopkins University's Counseling Center in Baltimore. I've been running process groups with university students. I believe I'm in my 8th year, and have been running online groups, process groups specifically, with university students since March.
And Shemika, similarly, were these groups continuing for you, or were some of them new groups that you started online?
Yes, so they are groups that were already in existence that I then moved to online platform, and I am using Zoom as well.
Thank you. Josh, it's you.
Sure. How do you do? I'm Josh Gross. I'm a group and family psychologist. I serve as director of group programs at Florida State University Counseling Center. We're currently running online 30 groups with 26 staff, 4 interns, and 2 residents. We're in our 9th week. I do 5 groups a week with university students and colleagues, so I have now done 46 groups as of this evening online in the last 9 weeks. I also run a consultation group where I work with people who are interested in gaining understanding toward a CGP or other kinds of advanced training. I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome.
I'm pronouns are my he, him, his, and we're doing Zoom.
Okay, excellent. So let's get into some questions. So as a reminder for to panelists, please keep your answers under a minute. And if we are running out of time for any particular question and you're answering that question in a moment, I'll privately chat you and I'll just message time so you know that we need to move on. Okay, so first question for the panelists is, what norms do you establish or emphasize for your online groups that you typically don't for your in-person groups?
Yeah, I can start. So there's a few Zoom specific norms that I've had to create, obviously that didn't exist. And so in brief, those are, before the group even begins, making sure everybody is using a laptop, not an iPad, right, or a phone, because they need to have gallery view. You'd think that would be obvious, but it's often not. Private location, making sure their back's against a wall, so if someone does walk in, the privacy is protected of the group. Noise canceling headphones to protect others from hearing. And something I just learned this week that was not a norm I created is to not allow people to private message, because I experienced this week somebody being scared to say something aloud and private messaged a member. So that's a new norm I'm creating. But in terms of the more interesting interpersonal norms, 2 that I've started using that are for online is saying somebody's name directly, because nobody knows who's looking at who, who's talking to who. Another one that people are struggling to follow is to verbalize when they notice themselves smiling and nodding in response to somebody, their face lighting up, because again, people aren't really able to look at every box. So I'm really encouraging the norm of voicing, hey, Beth, as I heard you share, I was nodding and my face had this huge smile, for example. So those are a few.
I think the notes have to reflect that. We start with a paragraph that says, so-and-so is a member of an online group. And then we make a clear statement that online group is not the same as face-to-face, but that we think we can do some useful work in this format. I'm also, in my note, I think at the closing, we make a pretty clear statement about whether or not there were any risk management issues, something I normally don't feel compelled to do, but on the Zoom format, I do. I've changed my group orientation, and I talk about the instrument, and maybe I drift a little bit from Alana here, in that I have a lot of students who do log on phones and pads. So basically, we talk about the instrument. We have talked about confidentiality has taken 2 forms over time, and that's the content of what we speak and the identity of membership. So we kind of talk about how to negotiate being on a campus where a third party might see 2 group members together. That's identity as a group member, and we want to be able to preserve that. But we also have the idea that, do you know the difference between someone else's story and your story? Because someone else's story you can't tell. You can tell anybody you want your story. So I think that's an important difference. Now we've added a 3rd component, which is the instrument, whether it be, in our case, A desktop, a laptop, a pad, or a phone, it emits light, which shows people, and it emits sound, which you can hear people. And so we agree that everybody is in a circumstance where they're isolated, and we don't use chat because it's just too much.
And I'll quickly say too, so I've been talking to a number of counseling centers throughout this process. And I think there's a learning curve that a lot of us are going through, especially people that had in-person groups and are transition. And a lot of these things are recognizing, oh, next time I need to establish these norms regarding confidentiality and how that might be different, or group behaviors. And I love, Alana, what you were talking about, saying the name of the person that you're noticing. And of course, that chat feature, that's something that I think a lot of people are recognizing, oh, we need to do that. So I'd encourage you right now, if you are noticing any of those things in your groups, to be taking note of that, so that come summer groups or fall groups, if we're still in this place, that you can update your consent forms and your pre-group meetings, your group screens, group orientations, that you can be helping establish these norms earlier in the process.
Yeah.
So I do some of the things that were mentioned. The one that was not, in terms of what I sent to my members prior to them starting online, is kind of inviting them to pay attention for themselves and for other people of when people are disengaging. So in almost an overt way, inviting them to pay attention, because it really is easy to disengage when you're kind of doing online work, and especially not a one-on-one where it's always you engaged in a conversation. When it's multiple people, like, you can find yourself looking away. And so actually included that in the written guidelines and suggestions that I sent out to members, to kind of notice that within themselves and to also pay attention to it for other members, kind of sharing that responsibility with the group members. And then there are a couple of structural or more administrative things, like I actually lock the meeting when all members have attended, and let them know if they're not there within a certain amount of time, the meeting will be locked and they won't be able to get in. I definitely use the waiting room. And one of the things that hasn't been mentioned is in terms of confidentiality and with online work, the general guideline of knowing where people are, I bring each of my members in one at a time and have them send me their location of where they are on that day, while I change their name to just their first name. And then I put them back in the waiting room and admit everybody else all at once. So just wanted to add that, because that hadn't been mentioned yet.
Yeah, Shemika, so it sounds like you admit the person and then remove them, and admit and remove them, and then admit everybody.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So that does take a couple of minutes away from the group time, but now it's been, everyone knows what's happening when it's happening. And so it's starting to go quicker now than it was the first time and the first couple of times that I did it. But it also does allow us to both get everyone's location, and they are pretty open about sharing their last names, but having that to be changed for in case anyone is uncomfortable with it.
Excellent. So another question that I have for you is, what have you done to help group members like follow some of the norms? And I think some of you've, Shemika, for example, elaborated on some of this, but norms like eliminating distractions, like paying attention, things like that. Any things that you've done to help members with this?
I can say, in terms of the norm I was mentioning of members voicing when they're smiling, when they're nodding, when they're doing something with their face, that is something that at least all three of my groups are still struggling with. So I will prompt them, and I'll say something like this happened earlier in one of my groups, like, hey, Bob, are you aware of how Mary's face lit up after you spoke to her? So I'll do some of the work of bridging them and naming these things. Or like, let's say somebody's sharing and they're going into a shame response. I'll say, hey, Ben, can you look around the room? what are you noticing on people's faces? Or, you know, what are you noticing about Bob's body posture as you were talking? So those are some of the things I do to help with the norm of getting them used to actually naming and talking about what they're noticing in themselves and other people. Yes, in terms of like the distractions and people coming in and out of the room and these little things that are really big, huge pieces of the confidentiality and privacy, I continually try to reinforce. If I notice, this has happened a few times, I hear somebody's mom and she's yelling through the door and starts to open the door, I will make a comment about it immediately. I like to use the group more, but in that moment, it feels like a hard line for me to have to really be firm, because that would make the whole group feel unsafe. So those are a few things.
I'll quickly share two things, and I might be able to, nope, I can't share my screen, but so the online etiquette that Chaim Weinberg has created, I think a lot of people are using that. I include that in the group agreement forums, and then we'll refer to that over and over again. And right now I am doing a drop-in support group with the Gender and Sexuality Center. So that creates a whole different thing. And if I stop my video, it's not doing it. It's too bad. I must be logged in with my other account, but I have saved as my profile picture. If you notice a lot of people who have their profile picture, it's just a list of our group norms. So some of the etiquette things, but also how confidentiality works. And so that way we can have that up. So I have my face, but then I'm signed in with my other account. So that's always up in the group that we can all refer to as needed or note. So it's a kind of another nice way to be reminding people of those etiquettes and other norms.
So essentially you're logging in twice?
Correct. I do it from my phone, from my personal Zoom account, and then I'm logged in through my professional one. So it's just always there as a group member, our group norms.
So as far as our, this is for all participants, as far as the resources, we will be uploading we have shared drive for college counseling SIG with some of the resources, some examples, including norms that Nate is talking about. So after this webinar, we will be I will be emailing everybody a link to that drive, so you will have access to all of that. And on the drive, we also have a list of trainings for online therapy, including for online groups. And there's Chaim Weinberg's trainings on there as well, linked to them. So you will have access to that as well. And just as a reminder to everybody, if you have questions, please send them to Vinny. I have really hard time trying to look at questions and also pay attention to what our panelists are saying. So I apologize. I know this is not kind of the perfect system right now. So we'll move on to the next question that we have prepared. And once again, audience questions will be answered in the second half of the webinar. Okay, so thank you so much for those examples. By the way, some like really great ideas that I definitely hadn't thought about before. So as far as confidentiality, I think that's one of the biggest concerns for university counseling centers. How do we help people protect other members' confidentiality in the group? So I'm curious, what confidentiality or privacy issues have you had happen in your online group so far, and how have you addressed them?
It's definitely one of the things that I included in the original guidelines, the importance of confidentiality and how that could extend to online in a different way than it does in in-person groups. And so doing some of those things like encouraging that if anyone else is in the house or apartment or wherever the students are, if anyone else is present, that they sit against the wall so that even if unexpectedly someone walks in, there's no chance of them being able to see the screen, and using headphones if someone else is present. I should say that the groups that I have continued online are my two graduate student groups. The majority of my undergrads left the state, and so either were not interested in were not able to, based on kind of state-to-state practice, to continue. And so I wasn't able to continue my undergrad group, but my 2 graduate student groups are continuing. And they've actually taken it upon themselves to even mention when someone else is present in the house or residence, wherever they are. They're never in the same room, but they'll always have headphones on, and they'll always say, you know, I want everyone to know my partner, my roommate is 2 doors down. They should not be able to even hear me. But even if so, you know, they can't hear anything you are saying, but they'll actually name that themselves. And that's not something that I outlined for them to do, but it's become a norm for both of my graduate student groups, actually.
So speaking of this, if somebody like comes into the room, Alana, there was a clarification question for you. Can you elaborate on how you safeguarding safety? Like if somebody's trying to come into the room or comes into the room, what specifically are you doing?
Yeah, so this has been really challenging because the group members are aware that nobody can be in the room, that nobody can see or hear group. But, you know, this has been an issue only with my undergrads actually, because they're back at home with their parents, right? No matter how many times I say it, it's gonna happen. Someone's mom's gonna be yelling through the door, or some sibling's gonna like open up. Thank God I've never had somebody see the group, but we just hear them. So I feel the most that I can do is when it happens, address it in the moment. Tell them, you know, remember, we cannot have anybody else see or hear this group. You need to tell them to close your door. And I'll remind students, hey, can you tell your family members that from 9:30 to 11 every Monday that you're, even if they don't want to say they're in therapy, that you have an important meeting and you cannot be disturbed. So those are some of the things I do. But at a certain point, it's going to happen. And I've been lucky that nobody, again, has like come in and seen the group members, but naming it in the moment and being pretty firm about it is the most that I've been able to do.
I think one of the biggest instabilities that we've had to face in the groups I've been doing is Zoom's irregularities. Today I did probably 6 Zooms, and in 4 of them, people disappeared and then came back. I had a student in the middle of quite the soliloquy, and all of a sudden her voice was gone.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I think part of the problem with all of this is we all want to do a really good job, and we want to provide a stable, containing environment. But, you know, part of it is just it crumbles. Mm-hmm. And I think part of that is just remaining resilient and in a position of trying to just do the best with what you got with what's happening. Because it's very wild and woolly.
Right. And that makes me think of trying to be non-shaming, because a lot of the students I see are in environments where it's not their fault. They would love to have the privacy, but you know, they are in a packed house and there's not a lot of private space. And also culturally taking that into account, that telling your parent, hey, do not enter this room might not be culturally appropriate to speak to your parent in that way. And so just, this is something I'm a work in progress around, sort of how to be firm and also not be shaming and be sensitive.
I'll tell you, there are a lot of kids who are doing group on a phone in a car, and you can see the handle behind them in the back seat. And, you know, car becomes a pretty good environment.
And my reaction to that is with the phone, even you can't see all the members at a time. So for the purpose of group, it's so hard, right? Because you can't get the gallery view. But if that's the only option, then that's what they have to do.
Well, not a lot of my kids don't have resources, you know. It's a pretty wealthy population at my university. And a lot of the kids who I see are on the poverty side.
Mm-hmm. So. Exactly.
Connectivity costs kind of.
I will ask you to elaborate a little bit on that when we get to a different question, but I think this is actually very important. Like, how do we help members engage if they don't see everybody? So if you would speak a little bit later to that, I would really appreciate it. And I'm sure other people who are listening in would as well. So in the meanwhile, we'll move on to a different question. but I want to pause, like any other confidentiality issues that you've had that haven't been mentioned, and have you handled them?
Kind of combining the confidentiality and the distractions question. I've seen this presented as a confidentiality issue. I don't see it in that way, but pets have been a thing that have had to be accounted for, but in some ways I've not. I know that some really strict folks think that, you know, you have to tell everyone that they can't have their pets coming in because that's a confidentiality issue. I have in the guidelines expressed that people need to be mindful of minimizing distractions and making sure that they're able to be in a private location, remain focused. And I've had members' cats to walk across the screen literally during session. And actually, my co-facilitator and I, in those circumstances, have not addressed it outright, in part because it happened more like at the very beginning and pandemic that no one expects. And these are not people who signed up for online groups. These are students who signed up to come to the counseling center and be in their groups. And now all of a sudden they're being, you know, thrown into a new context for both their academics, their personal life, or their therapy situations. And so we had a conversation about, like, if it becomes an issue where everyone is being distracted or it feels unmanageable, then we would bring it up. And it naturally kind of has gone in the opposite direction, where the cats aren't present as much, or they're just walking right past, and you barely even notice it unless you see the tail sticking up and the members kind of rubbing their cats, and it's soothing to them. And so I know that's something that everyone wouldn't agree on, but that's how my co-facilitator and I have managed those situations where it's only been cats because the majority of my group members have cats and not any other animals, but that is something that has come up.
Some cat people in Shemika's groups, right? Okay, so we'll move to the next question about emergencies. So what is your protocol for handling emergencies if they come up in the group, such as like if a group member decompensates in the group, or needs to be addressed one-on-one, or if you have members with suicidality, how do you manage that? Or like, how do you have your exclusion criteria?
I can say a little bit. So kind of what Shemika said, but I don't do it as in the same way. Hers sounds definitely the most cautious way. In their telehealth consent, they put their address, and I let them know if any week you are not at the address that is on your consent form, you need to message me like through our secure portal and let me know. And if sometimes I'll just notice like someone's at their partner's house or whatever, and then I'll remind them, hey, you need to message me. And that's, of course, in case there was some sort of risk issue and I needed to know where they were, right? Another situation that happened 2 weeks ago in one of my groups is someone brings up having suicidal thoughts. And interestingly, that was the week that they couldn't see or hear me because of tech issues. And then 7 of the 9 people said they were having suicidal thoughts. So if someone's bringing them up in a way that sounds concerning, I will sometimes ask a few more questions in the moment in front of the whole group. That was guidance I've gotten from somebody I consult with. But then I will call the student after. If it sounds concerning to me, I will call within an hour or two to say, hey, you brought up some suicidal thoughts in group. I just wanted to check in, and I'll do some sort of assessment to see if they need more support, hospitalization, kind of safety planning. I always keep crisis support numbers on hand also to give students, but I do try to assess for this when I'm doing recruiting too. And if somebody's had a history of 10 suicide attempts in the last year, for example, I might be a little more hesitant, because group can be triggering and bring up really shaky feelings. So that is something, but inevitably, especially college students, almost all of them have suicidal thoughts at some point.
I think one of the reasons we were pretty successful in getting our groups across is that the administration decided it was going to go online. And when that happened, we made some fundamental decisions about how to use TI. So we do 4 forms for every telehealth visit. And one of them is a specific statement of where you are at the time of this sign-in. So we address that, and we get, you know, an informed consent. We get an informed consent for telehealth. We get a where you are, and we get a consent for treatment. So we get 4 forms, and it kind of handles the thing about where they are, and we are always kind of looking at that. Students do move around. So sometimes students sign in at different places. So if they're at their mom's house, but then their baby at an apartment or somewhere else. So we tolerate some of that migration with the understanding that the lifestyles, it moves.
Yeah, I've not had the safety issues to come up in a way that I felt additional action was necessary. So if someone brings up thoughts about suicide, you know, that's not necessarily gonna alarm me to the point that I feel like additional action is necessary. But if that were the case, I think it, again, I've not had the situation to come up yet, but Zoom also has the breakout room feature, and I have co-facilitators for the 2 groups that I am running. And so I think I would use the breakout room if intervention was, felt like it was necessary at the time of the group. Depending on the situation, I don't know if it would be kind of in that very moment or at the end of group, but just using the additional features in the platform being used, I think, is one way that you can check in with a person individually if needed, using your co-facilitator if you have one. If not, I think following up in whatever way feels appropriate to the situation. And so if we were in person and someone brought up suicidal thoughts, we'd explore it in the group space. If they brought it up in the group space, we'd explore it. And if additional follow-up was necessary, then you'd follow up with the person after group. And I think online, I kind of had the same attitude towards that, just following up in whatever way feels like it makes sense using the resources that you have. If for whatever reason you get disconnected from that person, reaching out through other means, calling them, but just managing the risk based on your clinical knowledge and judgment.
Okay, we'll move to the next question to keep us moving along. So as far as tech issues, I know Josh already mentioned there's been tech issues are pretty common with this environment. So what technological issues have you had, and how have you addressed them or handled them?
Just last week in one of my groups, as we were admitting, renaming, putting back into the waiting room, the remove from meeting button is right under the put back in the waiting room, I think it is. And someone was actually accidentally removed from the meeting. And, you know, thinking about it ahead of time, as I was in my settings, thinking, you know, if someone is removed from the meeting, should they be allowed to re-enter? And I thought to myself, no, like if they've been removed from the meeting, there's obviously a reason, right? Not thinking that there's no, are you sure you want to remove this person prompt that you get when you click that button. I wasn't aware of that. And so I found this out at the time of group when one of my members was removed, and ended up emailing like, I can't get back in. It's saying that because you removed me, I can't get in. And this was actually the start of the session right after this member had a conflict with another member. And so I'm thinking, you know, how clinically that might look to the client. I know that he was anxious after kind of the session did go on, have been anxious about even coming back to this next group session, and then he gets removed from the group by the facilitators. So we ended up just creating a new link, sending it to everyone, we admitted everyone else, let them know that we had a technical error and needed to create a new link. It was coming to their email, and then got everybody else in that way. So kind of thinking through all of the settings is one of the things that sometimes it seems like some of the settings would make sense. Like if you remove somebody, would you want them to re-enter? But without that prompt, that can happen accidentally, and that's the consequence. So the waiting room has actually been safer for me to use and to rely on than that feature, which I turned off. And then again, locking the meeting. I only send out the link an hour before group time. Those are the most significant, that's the most significant concern I've had.
I think I'll quickly say, I mean, I've been surprised at the minimum number of technical issues that I've encountered. I was anticipating a whole bunch. And it feels like when I give a presentation and have to set up the PowerPoint and projector, it seems like probably 40% of the time there's technical issues. And so I'm always prepared for that with giving presentations. With doing this online work and with groups, I would say it's more along like 2 to 5% of the time there's been technical issues, which might not at all line up for other people. And there's, I think in the training that I've gotten, just being more comfortable with the tolerance for a lot of those technical issues that do come up. And so, for example, a person getting kicked out of the group because of connection issues, and then they come back in 5 minutes later, or their computer shuts off, or all those types of things. And I think so far, I haven't faced anything too significant, but all the group members, and me included, with having that level of tolerance, I think has gone to smooth things over in a lot of different ways. So.
I would say in almost every group, there's something that happens, but often it's very minor. Like, I don't think I've been through a group where one person their Wi-Fi doesn't work for a minute and they're kicked out, or we can't hear someone for a moment, but those things have been, just kind of part of it. But I had a very serious, something happened 2 weeks ago. I mentioned briefly, I worked from home for the first time. Most of my colleagues are working remote, but I still come in, and I used a Chromebook, and long story short, my group said, Alana, we can't hear you. There's a lag. So they suggested turn off the video. So I'm like, okay, turn off the video. A little better. They still can't hear me. It gets to the point where they couldn't hear anything I was saying, and my video was off. So they couldn't see or hear me. So I, for the remainder of the group, had to facilitate over chat. It was very upsetting and led to, interestingly, as the second that I wasn't visible visually or auditorily, that's when everyone started talking about suicide. So from an unconscious level, it's kind of interesting. But it was pretty traumatic for me, and a lot of the members messaged me after and said the group was overwhelming, anxiety provoking, just to, not having that container of the leader in the way that I normally am. So yeah, and that I didn't really have another choice but to continue the group, and I would put in chat what I would want to say verbally, but then they would get it delayed and it would be after the fact. So it was really hard. But I messaged all the group members after just to say, I acknowledge, I imagine you have lots of thoughts, feelings, reactions to what happened today. And I invited them to reach out to me, and privately, but also to bring it to group the next week. And yeah, it was very troubling.
Yeah, Alana, sounds really stressful. I can't even imagine being in that situation. If something like that was to happen again, do you think you would consider just canceling group for that day, or would you still try to facilitate?
Good question. Good question. I'm curious what others' reactions are. In a way, even though it was very challenging, I think a lot came out of that group. With them having to take much more control. I tend to be too active in my group, so I'd have to think about that. I'm curious what others would have done.
Something that's been brewing for me for a bit that I'll speak to right now with Alana, you sharing that, and some of these other questions we've been going through with confidentiality and the technical issues and establishing norms. I think it's just the reality of how much pressure is on your shoulders as a group leader. Regardless, even BC before COVID, there was a lot, but there's so much more now. In my private practice, I've just said, well, I'm not going to work anyone that has active suicidality. That feels ethically the right thing to do. So I'd screen anyone out in that way. And that worked in that world before COVID. That doesn't work now. So then all of that ethical responsibility is on my shoulder. How do I manage that? And how do I manage these technical issues? So I think it's really important to note how much pressure you all are probably under. And it is too much, I think. And maybe one of the reasons why we have, according to what I see, 260 people on this call is we're all needing help with being able to navigate these things. And so I think that's worth putting out too, that wow, wow, what we're all dealing with.
Wow, what we're all dealing with. I mean, just take APA, for instance. I mean, I know we have many disciplines in this call, but if you just tracked over the last 9 weeks, I mean, it's been a 45-degree angle of the production of policy documents to give us guidance. I think it's really important. I mean, it is the wild, and it's the Wild West.
Yep.
And I think, I don't know how to answer that. I probably would have shut the meeting down if I was not there. That would be sort of my approach. I don't know that that's a good choice. I don't know that what you did was not a good choice. I don't mean to suggest that in any way. But it's, as Nate is saying, a lot of things happen and we got to kind of be on it. So a lot of the supervision and training I'm doing with my interns and residents, we're all running a lot of groups as well, is try to stay in best practices and try to engage in as much risk management as possible. I mean, it's tough.
Yeah, I think this reminds me how helpful it is to have a co-facilitator when things like that happen, and how difficult it is if you don't have one.
Well, I'll speak to that. I think the co-therapist thing, see, we got started, our first push was to get all our groups up and then to get all the cases that were in motion up. In that time period, we weren't at the center because we were all at home and dispersed. So my center did a great job during spring break about getting us the necessary CE software and technology. And, I had just come back from AGPA, and like all of you, and or a lot of you, and we were all shell-shocked and freaked out because we've been exposed. And so, those emails were pouring out, and all the while we're trying to erect a program. We got the groups up, but then the issue was, how are we going to do walk-ins? How are we going to do intakes? And how are we going to replenish those groups? And that's really where we are now. We're in about week 3 of that. We're doing initial consults online, which is very dicey. I don't like it. I've been looking for good CE. It's hard to find. The closest thing I could get, and I wasn't able to make it, was a neuropsychologist did a whole thing about online because they have all kinds of test security issues. So I'm going to pick up another one. I don't know, I think later in the week. I think we just all need to saturate ourselves in as much CE as we can to try to steer away from the pitfalls and try to stay close to best practices.
So let's talk a little bit more about process. And then we've touched on those things here and there. But so I know everybody's on the call wanting to hear more about this. So what's your experience been like with interpersonal process and member-to-member connection and cohesion in online environment?
Let me just say something. Oh, go ahead, Shemika. Go ahead.
Really hard to manage, not just in and of itself, but there almost feels like there's a need for my group members to have a space to talk about what's happening in outside of group. It almost feels like it's necessary for them to talk about how they're coping with COVID, because where else would they be able to process that? And that feels very content driven. And it feels like they can get stuck there sometimes, and it feels necessary in order to move into the process work. So when it comes to just talking about how people are coping, which is still happening every week, the group members are still checking in with each other about how they're doing and talking about how they're coping and how productive they've been, managing their supervisor relationships. And there's a point at which it feels like, okay, now we're avoiding something. Now it's no longer that there needs to be a space to let this out in order to move forward. And now it feels like I don't know what we're talking about. And sometimes I'll just say that, or I'll say, it feels like, I know we're not in a room, but it feels like we're not in the room when that shift occurs. And it's not something that I could easily define or give an indicator of when that happens. It's really an internal feeling that I have. My co-facilitator is great, and oftentimes when I'm there, she's also there. And so either she or I will kind of point that out. But that is one of the things that I'm noticing, in addition to it being hard to figure out how to just facilitate that interpersonal connection. It's also something that feels necessary to give space for content specific to how people are dealing with COVID.
I think it's really challenging to be doing a process-oriented group right now with the external climate. As you say, it's going to be content-driven, and would seem to be the fallback, a natural position for the group to enter. I think much of it might have to do with how you start the group, and my suggestion would be to start the group firmly with emotional content, and something like, how are we feeling right now? What's our emotional experience? Not even feeling, because if you use the word feeling, people are going to drift away into content. So try to keep each other focused on feeling in the moment to start the group, to set the tone anyway.
Thank you so much for the comment. I want to say also that I don't know what happened. Everybody kind of like a bunch of people got unmuted. Hold on one second. Okay, here we go. If there are additional comments to something that the panel has not said, we'll leave a little bit of room for that in the second half of the workshop. So I apologize, I didn't specify that earlier. All right.
I can follow up with what Shemika said. I feel like it's been really interesting to see how the interpersonal connections and difficulty being in the here and now is being impacted or not. And I've noticed some members, yes, they have a harder time feeling other people, reading their reactions, feeling connected, and they can be prone towards like disengagement, checking out. But I've noticed other members, they almost feel safer in an online group, knowing they can retreat if they need, right? And let's say there's an uncomfortable moment into their personal space. And so in some groups, and then in some moments, I almost feel like there's more ease at being here and now and connecting interpersonally. But the piece about needing space to talk about COVID and how that's impacting us, as Shemika said, is so real. And so there can be that difficulty, right? Because we don't want it to turn into just like a COVID support group, but it's also what's present for them. So something that's come up, or an intervention that I've found cool, is something like, so we've become a very supportive group during this pandemic, and I wonder if it might be hard to talk about other feelings. So sort of looking at, is there not, as Shemika said, something being avoided? Is there a way that if we stay in this piece about COVID and how it's impacting us, that it's safer than going into the here and now? So sort of just making a comment about that, and asking the group and saying, is this the kind of group that you want? Do you want this to just be talking about COVID, or are you wanting other things too?
I like that it's kind of also putting it on them. It's like it's not what you're wanting, but what is group wanting.
Right, exactly.
And Alana, it's pretty clear that you do a lot of process-oriented work. You've given a lot of great examples of here and now interventions. And my experience is there's, of course, always resistance to getting into the here and now.
Yeah.
And so I kind of play a little game in my head, usually a first group session, of how many here and now interventions I need to make before the group actually kind of bites, or a member bites and goes for it. And I've had a similar experience with online groups where sometimes it takes a little bit longer for the group to follow. Sometimes they go quicker. And I've had enough experience with online groups and in-person groups where there's a difference online and in-person, but getting into the here and now, you can do it just the same in group as outside of group. There's not necessarily a difference in my mind that, oh, it's harder online. I think what I've experienced, a year and a half ago when I did my first individual session online, and I'm a very relational therapist. I like to do here and now work in individual therapy. I just didn't like it. And I left that first online therapy session just feeling like online therapy is not as good. I don't like it. And the number I used is it was about 60% as good as in person. But with continued practice and testing things out and having fun and trying out different things, that's gotten better and better. And I would say for the way I do therapy and my experience with online work, probably the best I've gotten is about 92% as good as in person. And so most sessions, between 80 and 90%. And I think it's the same thing for group. And so I think it can be easily to quickly attribute, oh, it's online work, so therefore I can't blank, or it's harder to get into the here and now. I don't think that's necessarily true.
Right.
I think there's more, just a lot of differences in the experience of it.
Right. And I wanted to tag on to that I think it can become, I don't mean this in a pejorative way, like an excuse. Members will say, oh, just not the same. Oh, we can't connect. We're online. It'd be so different. So I have a lot of interventions I do. I'll say like, okay, if we were in the room right now together, who would you want to be sitting across from? What would you want to say to them? What do you notice on their face? And it's like, it goes deep. And so I'll say, yeah, you guys are right. It's not as easy online, but I think we can make this powerful, but we have to put in some work. So it does take extra work in the leader. I feel like I have to be more active too. It's hard.
Just to add one additional comment about the way it can feel like it's turning to support around COVID. Just other kind of quick and dirty interventions are like, what if the group has all been supportive of one another before? This seems to fit with where the group has been with each other before. And if they haven't, like, oh, I'm noticing everyone is in a supportive space right now, or like being supportive towards one another, that's different. And that very easily switches to, oh yeah, because usually we are blah, blah, blah. And that brings people into the here and now. So even though it feels like space is needed to have group members talk about their experiences in COVID, which can feel like it's turning to support, there are ways to integrate here and now, even with that.
Josh, I'm curious, you've seasoned group therapist. How has it been for you to now all of a sudden do all the groups online, and what have you noticed?
You're muted, Josh.
You're muted.
First thing I want to talk about is my own personal experience. As you are looking at me and my right eye is pouring water, I am not down with the virus. I have a corneal abrasion, and I saw a surgeon this morning. I'm going to see my surgeon tomorrow morning. So I'm kind of coming to you old one eye. So that affects things tremendously because I'm in fairly substantial pain and my eye is tearing. To be frank, I was very surprised. I mean, I have done consultation group online for a few years. So I'm used to negotiating content process, mostly in a consultation format. And I have done some individual and group work in a variety of formats. So when we came across, I was just so surprised how well it went across, but I'm also impressed with my staff meeting and my group admin meeting. Now, my group admin meeting has sometimes in excess of 30 people. And, you know, everyone's doing pretty well. We talk at our shop about all these kinds of things, but I think the most important thing is it's kind of good enough, you know, in a Hartman kind of way. It's good enough to get the job done. So someone asked a question about my comment. We altered our notes a little bit. We certainly introduced the idea that it's a telehealth group before we do any group note kind of formalities of describing what happened in the intervention and the individual persons. But then I also close on a comment about risk management, because if there's no risk management, I want to make that explicit. And to be frank, in all of the groups we've done to date, we've had no risk management event. These groups they made a nice transition from the group room live to these weekly patterns. I actually took I had an experience I've not had in a long time. I had an undergraduate group with 9 students in the spring, and we have the same 9 in summer. That's really rare for me to have that many kids stick around. So I think it's our job to adapt to this not good enough, but maybe somewhat good enough format and do the best we can. I don't know if that helps, but sorry. Oh, one eye.
Muted.
I'm muted, yes. So we already kind of started talking about this, exactly about techniques. How do we help students to be in here and now in the group? And I just want us to maybe elaborate on that a little more. If anything that you haven't said yet, how do you help students continue to be present and calling them out on their reactions and help them connect in the real time?
Can start. So a huge intervention, I should say, I do this in person, and I'm just doing it a lot online, is a modern analytic technique called bridging. Yeah. And so let's say Bob just started talking, I don't know, about, well, today I had someone say their best friend was killed. I might, if the group falls quiet for a second and I don't want to leave that person hanging, I might say, so Beth, how do you imagine that John's feeling as he just shared this with us? Or I might say, John, what do you think is keeping Sarah quiet in group today? So there are all these ways that I help them start talking to each other. There's so many of these examples, like, Bob, how is John's comment landing on Alicia? What can you tell from her face? So all of these are called bridging techniques. If I see somebody yawn, I'll say, do you guys think we're putting Sarah to sleep today? Do you think there's some deadness in the room? Or if there's a lot of advice giving, I'll say, could you try saying a statement about how you feel inside or towards the other person right before you give advice? So those are all different examples. And then one I learned from Chaim Weinberg is what I said. And it's so powerful. I had a member share something he was really feeling very, very... what are you doing, my love? Ooh, there's a voice. Uh-oh. Okay, I just unmuted myself. Last thing I'll say very quick is this idea, I had a member who was going into shame, and I said, if we were in the group right now, who would you want to be sitting next to and who would you want to sit across from? He immediately knew. He looked at the person who gave him comfort and he became tearful and got deeper into his emotional experience. So that was kind of amazing how powerful that was.
I'm muted. That's awesome. I also, it's helpful to hear how that worked for you trying it out for the first time, because I've also heard, suggestion from Chaim on that technique, and I was wondering how that's working. So that's really good to hear. I also I was curious, Alana, how students react when you ask them like how such and such group member is reacting to such and such group member. As I know sometimes students get like, oh, I can't, what? I don't know. I'm curious what that's been like for you and how students reacted.
Right. I think some students, not this quarter, have said in the past, like, oh, I feel on the spot, like, and then I go blank, but I think they get used to, they know that that's how I am. I do that a ton. So it's very normal for them at this point. And they just take a guess. I always say, just take a guess. How do you think this person's feeling? Or what's keeping this person quiet? And then the next step is to check in. Well, let's check in with this person. Are you on target? Or maybe not. And then the other person feels freer to then to share. It takes the pressure off of the person. Anyway, I'm not going to go on and on about it, but it has gone well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's helpful. Other techniques that you like that work online?
Well, I think the sky's really the limit when it comes to here and now interventions, and it's fun to play around with that. And I mean, I oftentimes will just articulate my here and now feelings and model it in that way. And so there's like even right now, there's the reality of our subgroup of folks that are presenting and have our videos on, and I'm feeling quite connected in some ways to a lot of these people, and then a lot of just silence and curiosity. What's going on for all these other people that are sitting here? And so that's a here and now feeling that I'm having, and I would, do things like that in group.
I don't believe, Nate, I've ever done a Zoom where I look and see that the page that we occupy only one of the rows of, and there's 11 more pages. I mean, 253 people now, that's quite a crowd, Chaim knows what to do with this stuff. And apparently we do too. I mean, this is going pretty well. But I do appreciate the subgroup description. Really caught my attention.
I'll also say I do a lot of trainings with, how to activate and illuminate the here and now. And after a while, I put together a handout that is essentially what Alana was doing for us. It's just example after example of here and now interventions that I use. And I find that helpful because it's kind of like riding a bike, that when I'm in the group, it's not very an analytical thing that, because blah, 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 I'm going to do this here and now intervention. It's more, I've seen this done before at a group at AGPA, or I've witnessed somebody do this. And so I kind of have an avenue into the here and now. And so it's a very much a practice-based learning experience for me. So if you're interested in this here and now stuff and you're wanting more of it, I would say come to AGPA or any of the affiliate societies, or call up Alana or Josh or anyone and try to find a group for yourself, because I think Yalom talks about it as being the bunny years. It takes practice with being able to be awakened to the here and now things, and then help other people, get steered into that, help your groups become more alive with that here and now work.
So what I'm hearing really is online, we're using really similar things that we're doing in person to illuminate the here and now, but maybe we're doing even more of that to help people, to help create the connection. It's kind of the theme I'm picking up on. Yeah. I'm also curious. So this relates somewhat back to confidentiality and norms. So when students get distracted, say you see somebody's checking email or tapping, and you want to bring this to the here and now and call this out. Can you give maybe some examples of language that you used so that it's gentle and yet at the same time firm? What's that been like for you to call those things out?
I'll acknowledge I get anxious a little bit each time I make interventions like that, and trying to balance being sensitive while also calling out the elephant in the room and being able to talk about it. Then yeah, like Alana said, not wanting to shame, but also being willing to step into that and handle any feelings that might come up, even if the person feels a lot of shame.
And I just want to say that I make mistakes all the time. So I'm sure I've said things that have not come across well or have been shaming, maybe unintentionally. And all these here and now interventions I'm talking about, they don't always go well. Often I'll make one and then people keep talking about how their classes are stressful. And so it is a process. It's not easy.
No, thank you. Yeah, that's normalizing to hear, I bet, because sometimes we try something for the first time and it doesn't work. We're like, shoot, I'm not going to try again. But sounds like you have to keep trying. So oh my gosh, I had a comment I wanted to make before we moved on. Oh, yes. So Nate mentioned having like a list of here and now interventions that he keeps. So we actually have the document that he's willing to share that with us. So it will be uploaded onto College Counseling SIG share drive, and that I will be sharing the link with you after this event. So just to put that plug in there. Okay, and we are to our last questions before we transition to audience questions. And so it's about yourself and your anxiety. So I'm wondering, what have you been most anxious about when it comes to online groups, starting online groups, and how you've coped with that anxiety, and has it gone away?
I can start. I'd say I was the most anxious before starting and thinking about doing online groups and doing them right and doing them well. And then I just had a moment where I said to myself, I'm not doing online groups. I'm doing groups with my college students, groups in my college counseling center that had to move online because of a pandemic. And seeing those as two different things gave me lots of space to just dive in. And I did it pretty immediately, kind of. All of this was taking place over spring break, and one of my two groups wanted to meet during spring break, and so literally didn't miss a beat with them. And then the other group did not want to meet during spring break, and so I started the second group 1 week later than the first group. And you know, I've done lots of trainings. I've attended lots of webinars, had conversations, have been a part of those consultation groups that the SIG has put on, which has been very helpful. But just that slight change in perspective shifted my anxiety, so I didn't feel like I had to become this expert in online groups, and that I just needed to continue the work that I was doing in a different way. And so now, no, as a matter of fact, when I was asked to be on the panel, I was like, why me? Like, isn't everyone doing their groups online? Because everyone just wanted to continue their work. And it was really shocking to me to find out that there are so many centers who have not continued their groups online to date, or are just getting started with that process. I didn't realize that, you know, a lot of folks did take a step back and say, okay, how do we do this? And you know, I don't know, I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's different from my experience, which was, I just need to continue my work. And having that shift in perspective was what allowed me to do that and to feel less anxious about it. And I'm guessing that there are some things that I could do differently. I've learned additional guidelines that I wish I could have included in what I sent out to my members before starting. There have been some things that have developed along the way, and you know, that's okay. It's okay that it wasn't perfect to begin with, but it's only okay in my head because I'm not doing online groups. I'm just continuing my groups in a different platform. So that's what immediately came to mind when I heard the question.
Thank you, Shemika. And by the way, I'm seeing messages from few of our participants that they would like to hear more from you. So no pressure, but sounds like audience members appreciate your voice.
I'll say this, that because I started my online private practice 1.5 years ago and went through this learning curve of how to do online work, including online groups. And so when the pandemic hit, and I put a few things out on the listserv, the counseling center listserv. And so there were a few counseling centers reaching out to me, wanting consultation on how do we get groups up and going. And it was just fascinating. And all of these conversations, at least with the people I was talking, because I came in excited, we're going to talk about the ethics of it and practicing across state lines and, you know, suicidality and the technical issues and what platforms you might use. And I was ready for that. And they had already pretty much gone through that learning curve pretty quickly. And so my experience, at least with the people that were calling me up, they've really did great diligence in working these things out. And what arose is what was really needed was more of that confidence and that kind of imposter syndrome and that anxiety. I'm too anxious. I'm probably going to be practicing unethically. So I need to figure this all out. I need some authority figure to come in and fix it for me. But as we sat with that, really, there isn't yet, because this is, like Josh was saying, it's the Wild West. And so helping people navigate those ethical decisions themselves of what are you willing and able to do. And so that's why I like this question about anxiety, because I see that being one of the big issues for a lot of people. Is it's not that I haven't yet learned enough. You've likely learned enough if you're as diligent as these people that I've been talking to. It's more of that getting over that hump. Can I actually just go for it and do it?
I think Shemika had a nice voice to that. I like the idea that I needed to get my groups running. I think that was very much my discussion with my director when we made that decision to do that. I really respect that kind of a position. You know, I write about anxiety, and I think that the members have anxiety, the leaders have anxiety, the referral source has anxiety, and the director has anxiety. And they're all really different flavors. But, you know, the director's anxiety has a lot to do with whether your group program's online, because you can be I mean, there's some wonderful group program people on this call, because I went through and I looked at everybody who aren't running groups because their directors didn't have the wherewithal or the go-to to make it happen. So I'm a big fan of us group leader people merging with our administration and getting administrative support so that you can have a meeting, because the way you get online when you're not online is you have a meeting where you can do that. So if you have a pre-existing group admin meeting, which we did, and we just put it online the next week, that's where all the problem solving occurred. So I think infrastructure is a huge part of this ability, but I also think that position that Shemika described is where it's at.
So we have a ton of questions coming in from the audience. No surprise, since we have over 200 people on this call. So let's transition to some of those. So I will be looking more to the side because I actually have two computer screens going, and Vinny's been doing an amazing job fielding all these questions and sorting them through. So, and we probably will not get to all the questions, and we're so sorry. And we know there's a ton of questions and we can be talking for days about this, but we're gonna try to hit the ones that have come up most often and that maybe things that we have not yet covered. All right, so one question I see that has come up commonly that I think maybe we can answer in a brief manner. Have you shifted the number of group members permitted in your online groups versus in-person groups?
No.
No.
All right. No for everybody. Okay. Well, there's that. Something that I've heard that it's good to consider how many people you can track off on your screen, and maybe your technological capabilities, something to be aware of as you're thinking about this. Okay. Also, as a reminder, please send questions to Vinny. If I'm getting questions, I'm going to try to attend to them, but I have a lot of things going on. So please, if you sent a question to me, resend it to Vinny. Thank you so much. Okay. Let's go to the next. So there's a lot of questions coming in for training, no surprise because University Counseling Center is a big training site. And so we often do groups with interns and practicum students and whatnot. Let's see. So, the question is, how have you been supervising trainees in doing group work virtually, if you have? Especially as you're kind of learning this yourself, as this is a new thing for you. How have you been doing the supervision? Have you changed anything?
You know, I think that the supervision of group work is complicated. And I think the model that we use is I have 4 doc interns and I do 4 groups with each intern. Group's 90 minutes. We bookend it with a half hour before, where we discuss what we're facing and what we know. And then we talk about what happened. I think so. It's a 2.5 hour intervention. we also have a supervision of group where we do that each Monday morning, and the 4 doc interns and I talk about cases. And we also have a group admin meeting. So we have a fairly active group based set of discussions to discuss the frame that we hold all this in. And I think that's really important. I'm a big fan of the structural component, and I think administration needs to invest in group programs if they want the economy of scale. And that investment is that meeting, because that group admin meeting, you know, if I have 30 people, that's 3/4 of a full FTE. It's 30 hours. 30 people are in that meeting for an hour. So it's got to be worth it to my boss in terms of his program return. A therapist can see 2 people in 2 hours or can run a group in 2 hours. The 2 of us, now it's 4. So if we have 5 members, we're a profit. 6, we're at a better profit. 7, 8, 9 is where we appreciate our economy of scale. And directors understand this.
I'm supervising 1 intern and 1 postdoc who are running an all men's group. It's more
Together? Alana, they're running together?
Yes, they're co-facilitators. It's not an interpersonal process group, more support oriented, but I would say that I'm supervising them in very much the same way as I would if it wasn't over Zoom, but just sharing with them the tips and tricks I'm learning about how to use this platform and make it as effective. But yeah, no major differences.
Same. No difference. Well, other than it being online and the pandemic. That's huge. But in terms of approach and I mean, I tend to be transparent in the work that I do with trainees, and have continued to do so now. And when I feel like there's something that I don't know, I say that, and that's not different for me. So it's been pretty much the same in terms of the relationship piece and how the supervision is facilitated, and how much I share, how much I put myself in the expert position, which I don't, and how much we talk through together what's going to happen. If anything, this has given the intern more of an opportunity to step in and have more a voice if they didn't before, because, you know, the playing field gets leveled when no one really is the expert and no one really knows what it is they're stepping into. So I found that it's actually helped to, in some ways, build the confidence and allow there to be more of a conversation, more of a consultation feel, while at the same time it being a supervisory relationship. So, but again, that's not very different for me and how I've supervised interns in the past.
So I have a clarification question to all of you. So as you're kind of preparing your trainees to do groups online, did you have them watch some kind of webinars, or did you like meet with them and talk about how they would go, what they would try, what like you would try, how they would try, how you would structure this? How did you approach this?
My counseling center operates under a mentor-apprentice model. So if I go somewhere, my apprentice comes with me. If I do something, my apprentice does it with me. Frequently, they start quieter and they end pretty active. It's a developmental experience. The doctoral internship year is a huge transformation for all of us. You know, I did mine in '81. So it's a huge transformation. So.
And the question, like, do you require that they watch a video or do some sort of webinar on Zoom therapy? Our counseling center required that all of us did some APA training on like teletherapy more generally, not group therapy, but it was completely useless and I didn't like it. So no, I haven't. I didn't ask my supervisees to do a webinar. I invited them to this, but I don't think they joined. So no, but that would have been good to do.
I'll share this. It might be a good time to, well, one is a feeling of jealousy towards Josh and your center, wishing we had more of that at ours. We have 3 doctoral trainees here 2 days a week, and we have 3 terms, and I lead 3 process groups. And so in an ideal year, we get to all rotate and work. But so the pandemic hit in between our winter and spring term, and I felt that pressure to get the groups up and going. And in some way, Alana, you talking about doing that, that's typically my shtick. But really, for reasons of burnout prevention, I decided to wait to see if there was the client demand, as opposed to me calling people up and trying to create the groups, which I think I could have done. And so far, we haven't necessarily had that demand. And part of it is because about 15% of our students are from Minnesota, so 85% are not. And so we have a lot less. So there's that battle that I could have fought. But one of the big losses is our practicum students are not getting that training and that online training, which is a loss that we can add to the pile of losses that many of us are experiencing. But I think that was important to say too, that there's something really valuable for me, even though this is what I do. I love online groups, that I didn't do that this term. And there's something really valuable about that, especially just knowing with college student or college counseling, how much burnout is a real issue for a lot of us. And so hopefully that was helpful maybe for someone to hear.
We have clarification questions coming in, a lot of them about state lines. I know this is sort of switching topics, but so the groups that you're doing with your students, are you only practicing in your state lines, or do some of you practice across state lines? And if so, how do you do that?
FSU is staying within Florida. It just gets very complicated. I think what's very interesting is the first time in my entire licensed practice, and my first license comes in January of '83, there was no example of a mental health professional calling up a neighboring state and saying, you know, this person I'm seeing has gone home because they had an injury and I want to continue seeing them. There's no way. Florida would never do that. But now a lot of states are. I know people who have a case-by-case arrangement with Georgia and some of the other local southern states. So we're seeing wholly new patterns. It really surprises me. But, you know, our licenses are state. And I only have a license in Florida and California, so I'm not doing any of the other states around Florida. How about you guys? Are you?
I can say I lucked out. I hope I'm correct that all of the people in my groups are in California, so I haven't had to deal with this because I'm in California. But I think the director of our counseling center sent out like a PDF. I think there's laws that have come out that have explained this particular to your state, if you are allowed to see people outside of state or not.
Yeah, it's the other state, not your state.
Okay.
Yeah, I can clarify that just, Alana, that interjurisdictionality per state, you need to be able to check in with a licensing board for that specific state. So for example, I have a student who's going back to Tennessee. I have to call the licensing board for Tennessee and get permission from them and temporary licensure authorization to be able to see them individually through telehealth. So that's why for us, similar to Josh and others, we're not doing any group work with people outside of state lines. And every state is different. Tennessee's ends on May 15th. North Carolina ends in like mid-June. So it would be too much to keep track of to do that with all the clients.
That's helpful.
Yeah, and I'm right now receiving some messages from our participants saying that they've been also applying for temporary licenses in other states, which is now much easier process, and you can get that pretty easily. But I think you do have to kind of do research about each state, because some states say, well, you can continue with a client who've already established, but you cannot start with a new client and all of that. So definitely take some administrative legwork to figure that out. So by the way, if you have answers to some questions that are posted to our panel that have not been covered, you can message me or raise your hand and I will unmute you. You can raise your hand by clicking on participants, I believe. Tell me if I'm incorrect on that one. There should be an option, raise my hand. So if you have something to add, okay. All right, thanks, forgot to mention that. Any other thoughts on state lines, or should we move on? Yeah, sounds like, okay, awesome. Sounds like we've covered that. All right, let me look what other questions are coming up that are common. Okay, out of state, we got that. Okay, so there's one question about populations who normally do not seek group counseling. So international students, students of color who may be more hesitant. So how have you seen that they've been willing to do online groups, especially for you who've tried to start like new groups that haven't continued? Have you experienced those populations, or how have you helped them be more open to online groups?
Just briefly, I'll say that the majority of my groups are students of color or international students. That's just the population that tends to seek CAP services at UCSC. Maybe it's just a skewed sample because these are the ones who sought out group and were responsive when I was messaging and setting up group screens. Also, a huge, I guess, piece that helps with that cultural barrier is I'll sometimes handpick for my clients. So if I have a client individually that I feel is really talking about issues around barriers to connecting and being authentic and patterns in their lives interpersonally, I'm thinking of 2 or 3 students of color and 2 international students who, because we had that relationship and I was able to explain about group in more depth, I got their buy-in when initially there was some understandable hesitation. But I don't see it as that different than the stigma around therapy in general, individual or group, for certain populations.
So it sounds like, so it sounds like, Alana, you're saying that the buy-in kind of feels similar as in person. Am I understanding that right?
Correct. Yeah, I haven't noticed a difference.
What about others?
I think it's a great question, and I don't think I have much to articulate as far as an answer. But I'm very curious what impact this is having on, because the barriers to accessing online groups. The one experience I have is with the Gender and Sexuality Center, this online support group we're doing, is we decided to advertise it to anyone that might affiliate with the Gender and Sexuality Center, any identity. But so far, the only people that have showed up are trans-identified folks. So in our little microcosm, that's something we're seeing. Those students are accessing the services. But yeah, I think that's a very good question. I hope someone has a good answer. Maybe we'll know more about that after a few more months or so.
Well, I know my director is concerned about getting the genie back in the bottle. He thinks all of us at home, no office overhead, no teletherapy going good enough. He's really concerned that the Board of Governors of Florida is going to go, oh, it is a great way to save some dough, particularly since all of our universities are having financial crises because it's unclear what we're going to do in fall. I mean, I myself don't believe. Florida State just canceled Summer C, which is the last 4 weeks of summer where all the incoming freshmen come, and there's a lot of basic programming that's all about student affairs and getting involved in campus. And so that's not going to run. So I imagine fall's not going to happen. I think we're out till December personally, but I don't have any data on that. So given that, I think what's going to happen is we're going to get all real good at this. And I think my interns and my residents are going to be practicing telehealth when I'm long gone, because it's not going to go back. It's too efficient at some level. I'm not saying it's great, but I don't know that will be outsourced, Misha, but I do think, I mean, there's been a lot of discussions about outsourcing, but we all know what the big box corporations do with stuff. And, you know, all the Florida schools use the same online overnight telehealth. It's called Protocol. And they're okay. They're good enough, but they're not super. So I don't think we're going to get bought out.
And speaking of buy-in, Josh, I remember you earlier, you were saying that you didn't, sounds like, have an issue recruiting people for your summer groups. Did I understand that correctly?
Correct.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But, you know, I think the biggest point that I've been trying to make over the last 20 years is have a group admin meeting. And if your boss says, no, I can't do it, it's too expensive, begin to work on them. Because the literature is really full of big fruits of return if you can get a group program running. And it's really different if you got one person who can run 5 groups, if you got 3 or 4 people who can run 3 or 4 groups, and then when you get 30 people running groups, it gets to be a real good thing. Director's not burning up in that meeting feeling that money's going away. He's watching probably the best case conference we have at the shop. So I think it can turn into a real win-win, but I'd like to get more schools having group admin.
So speaking of recruitment of clients, another question came up about accessibility, and I think we touched on this before too. So how do you deal with students who don't have access to resources such as maybe broadband internet, or maybe don't have privacy in their homes, or don't have access to laptops? And I know, Josh, you mentioned that you're fine with students accessing group from their phones, which I meant to ask you a clarification question about and I forgot. So how have you addressed those access issues? And Josh, specifically, how has it been like to have students on their phone, like do a group on their phone?
You know, I do a lot of meetings where someone's in a car. Actually, we had a staff meeting this morning, and my computer tech guy, is sitting in his car talking on the phone in the staff Zoom meeting. So I just think it's just one of the normal variants.
I think it's a social justice issue that I don't think we have an answer to right now.
Yeah, agreed.
The fact is, people who can do therapy right now, individual or group, are just the people who have enough resources to have Wi-Fi, to have a computer. And yes, most students, even very low socioeconomic status, which is most of the students we see, do have some kind of phone. So that is an option, but then it's still, there's this inequity, because when you do group from a phone, I know when I've tried, you can only see one person at a time and you're not really having the same experience. So I don't have an answer. At our university, we have something called slug support, and students can actually request, you know, like, hey, I need to do therapy, CAP said I need to, and they'll buy them a computer. So there are some funds that can help with this piece, but it's an enormous problem.
And that what you're speaking to, Alana, I think speaks to that there are so many different situations, right? And different schools have different resources. I was going to mention that I know my undergrad institution is providing that level of support to students. If they don't have laptops, if they don't have devices, they have placed orders. If they don't have Wi-Fi at home, they've ordered hotspots for students. And not all universities are engaged in that level of care, but there are some, right? And so that's a different situation for students who are receiving from the university than those who are at universities that are not providing and they don't have access at all. So I think the individualized situations really do contribute to the answer, and that's a part of why I think there is no one universal answer for everyone. But I like that you highlighted that it is a social justice issue, and I think that needs to be taken into account as we consider what are our options, what are the options for these students, what is it that we can provide to them, and what are we unable to, what is the limit where we say, okay, this really impacts other people, and so we can't do it in this way, but how do we say yes? How do we find ways to make adjustments and make careful considerations so that we are saying yes to students and providing for their needs, even if it's not in the way that we want to or that they want, just finding a way to provide based on the entirety of the situation, I think is really important.
Yeah, so sounds like making adjustments, even though maybe it wouldn't look like we would like it to, but sometimes we have to sacrifice that in order to provide services to students who otherwise would not be able to access them. Yeah. Okay, let's see. By the way, as a reminder, for audience members, if you have ideas, something to contribute, you can either send it to me in the chat or to Vinny. And Vinny, please feel free to unmute yourself if you get comments that you want to say out loud, or raise your hand and I will unmute you and we can hear from you as well. Okay. Okay, so there's some questions that are coming in about evaluations. So one, how do you evaluate trainees on group work in online setting? And two, how do you evaluate your groups? And is it any different from what you were doing before?
I actually hear a bird chirping somewhere.
So we have been using CCAPs, which I'm not very happy with, but I think as an instrument, it doesn't have enough ceiling for our population. So I think it yellows and reds up people real quick. But we also have a situation where like close to half of our kids are ascribing to suicidal ideas. So, you know, we're not using CCAPs right now per administration's decision. So we're kind of running bare. We're not doing anything structured. I think that's something we need to really beef up on. So I think we have some strengths, but I think we have some weaknesses too. Are others doing better? I hope so.
Well, we do the CCAPs for individual sessions, even when we're remote, they're still doing it. But for group, we've never done any tool or measure like that. I don't give CCAPs to my group members. So I don't have a formal evaluation process, and I never have. So that hasn't changed for my group members, other than in the moment processing at the last session of what this has been like. What have they gotten? People noticing shifts, but I don't have a formal measure.
Maybe after this conversation, you will going into a future term, or
Maybe. I'd love ideas about that.
I can say that we have really powerful data on our CCAPs, and we see primarily anxiety and depression come down significantly after courses of treatment,
Totally.
both in individual and in group. So I'm not sure what they're going to do regarding turning that back on. And should it persist like this, I'll probably want to implement some kind of a group measure, because we have some really excellent process and outcome measures to look at.
And I did see some email chain coming through the listserv on groups, people talking about like using Qualtrics to gather feedback, but it's it's not necessarily like an outcome measure, but rather feedback about people's experiences. So I saw that people are using Qualtrics to kind of gather feedback from group members.
Can say a quick note about another measure that we've used in the past. This is from, I think, Martin Whittingham, and originally introduced it to us from the focused brief group therapy thing that he does, but we've really liked using the inventory of interpersonal problems, 32. You get a sense of what people's interpersonal anxiety style is, whether they're non-assertive, focused on others before themselves, cold, distant, more warm and over-permissive with people. And it gives a nice frame of like what their anxiety is, not necessarily what they are. And having group at the end showing them the pre and post of if their anxiety has decreased in those areas is another unique group-specific outcome measure that I think we found useful at our center.
I also see somebody posting, so the core battery from AGPA has a lot of wonderful empirically validated measures to use for all things group related. So I guess it's coming from Wendy. The core battery, is this kind of a like what, a document? I'm not familiar with that. Or how might somebody access that? Hi, Wendy. Hi, thank you.
There's a publication from AGPA that had, there was a working group that did some really wonderful research in finding what they thought were the strongest measures for a whole host of different group-related factors, including outcome measures and a variety of other things. I don't know, Josh, if you can speak to that too, but I found it to be really a wonderful resource and would highly recommend it.
It's about 10 years old now, and it's due for a rewrite because there's a lot of new stuff happening. But again, I mean, you got to wonder why it's not being used more. I think we need to all wrap our heads around measurement. I think it's very important, both outcomes and process issues.
Right. Vinny, I want to solicit your help. Any questions that you're liking, because I'm kind of like getting lost in this document. Questions that you're liking that you think we should ask.
Yeah, some people have talked about some technical questions in terms of how they want people to set up their frame for the sessions, even if it's just how far away they are from the screen or what their backgrounds are like. And so, that might have been touched on some, but if other people have thoughts on how they explain that to clients, I think that could be useful.
I have a group that has 2 people with significant physical disability. One was shot and paralyzed, and the other was born with a neurological condition that looks like cerebral palsy, but they don't have cerebral palsy. Now, when we went to online group, the fellow with the neurological condition said, I've been with you for a couple of years in group. I think it's been good for me, but I'm not doing it on TV. Catch you on the other side. He had no risk issues. I think he was it's an aesthetic thing that he has. He has a really difficult condition. So we agreed, and we're taking a hiatus, and he's actually in another state. The other fella, the one in the wheelchair, he tends to get into the shadows, get dark, get small. So the group's been talking to him about that. And now he's a face. And we've been talking to him about backlight and front light and all those kinds of things. So I think the environment brought on this issue of the frame setup, but I think the group kind of just made its way through. Took a few visits, and I actually kind of like that process. I think it seemed organic.
Definitely some grist for the mill.
Absolutely.
I did a group therapy, an online group therapy training this last Friday with a lot of clinicians, mostly from Minnesota, wanting to practice online therapy work. And there was one person that's been doing it for a long time, and he talked about how, Vinny, you're a good example of wanting to get your face fully in the frame so you could see everything, the micro expressions and other things, and to be well lit. And that was very much what he wanted. And then someone else that's done a lot of groups, just starting in online, wanted their group members to be set back so you could at least see the top half of their body and be seeing the other movements, or maybe a shaking or bouncing. And there was a fascinating dialogue that happened, maybe 2 minutes, that I learned a lot and was considering some of the pros and cons. And so, yeah, I think there's a practice element in that. We're all practicing. We're wanting to practice and get better at therapy in general, of course, but then online therapy, and what are the pros and cons, what works for you, and yeah.
I definitely like the idea of grist for the mill, especially for process groups, to see what students do and then help them understand what that means and whether that's what they want to keep doing.
Yes, I love that. Yeah, I haven't set any rule of you must be sitting a certain way and be this close, More just what you're saying. Interesting to point out and observe what people are doing. Are they like this, right? Are they like whatever's happening?
Group, I think, does shepherd itself to some extent, and I think that's actually a good part of the work in terms of coming across this environment.
Go ahead, Vinny.
was just gonna move on to another question if you wanted me to.
I actually wanted to clarify something about the measures. I just wanted to ask, have any of you done like CCAPs or other measures you're using online? I know, Josh, you mentioned you maybe haven't done, your center hasn't done
my
online.
administration did not want CCAPs. The problem is that about 60% of our CCAPs are screening issues. And we just think it's too high a ratio, so we're not using CCAPs right now. Which means we're going bare, which makes group screens, initial consultations, and intakes really complicated.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around this, and I hope we talk more about this over time.
We're doing CCAPs for individual, but not for group, but we've never done it for groups.
Similar, the measure we use, BHM, we've used for individual, not for group, and that's continued.
Sorry, Shemika, you said BHM. What does that stand for?
Behavioral health measure, if I am correct. That might not be it. I only know it as a BHM, but I think it.
Yeah, Vinny says that's correct.
One of the things that I just thought of that we didn't talk much about, but I think is a really rich conversation, and I think maybe could continue offline or elsewhere, is the process of adding new members online, which I do find in some ways to be different than adding new members in person. Of my two groups, I've only added one new member while online. Actually, the week that the group restarted after spring break was the week that this person was already scheduled to join the group. And so there, I think, are some interesting topics and things that come up in that process, whether that be online screening process or kind of the different processes around that first session. In my in-person groups, there's this contingency that if you see someone in the waiting room that seems to be going into group, you don't enter the group and therefore don't ever have to have that conversation for the new person. And that's not really possible online. And so I think that's a huge topic that we haven't had a chance to touch on. And I hope those conversations will continue because it's really important to think through.
I agree, Shemika. I think that's a huge issue. And I think I can see already that this should be the first of a series of these. You up for another one, Kseniya?
Yeah, so another question, you mean?
No, I think we ought to have another panel. I think there's a lot of room.
Oh, another panel. No, another panel, my bad.
panel.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like we do need a repeat of this. Maybe once we all get a little more experience and figure some things out, there's for sure a lot of things to talk about.
Well, he's been writing me interesting topics. I mean, he's got an agenda for us.
I think we have time for one more questions today. Yeah. So Vinny, I know you had something in mind. I also noticed that we haven't talked about co-facilitator dynamic. So that's on the table. Vinny, what did you have in mind?
I think that was one of the ones that came up a lot in terms of co-facilitator dynamics, just in general. Like, how do you, instead of how we might be in the same room and I might nudge, like, we need to take care of this group member over here and check in on them. How do you creatively adjust to that in the online format? And how does that look differently in terms of with new supervisees who are coming into this format for the first time, potentially in fall, assuming this continues in fall?
So experiences with co-facilitator dynamic, are there things that you pre-established with your co-facilitator beforehand? Things have been different. Did you divide roles in a certain way?
Are we addressing that now, or is that a?
Yes, yes, yes. Yes, that's a question for you right now, our last question.
So I feel really lucky that the person, I'm co-facilitating both of my graduate student groups with the same person. And we've been working together since the end of August, since the start of the training year. And she actually just joined the second group after we moved online, actually. But we've established a good working relationship where in person, there would be times where we'd kind of catch each other's eye. And somehow I feel like I know when she's looking at me on the screen, and I tell myself that she knows when I'm looking at her. And so I think having that relationship is really helpful. And I'm starting to think through, what will this look like with a brand new person? And so that's something that I'm now starting to kind of think about for August as it comes up. But I feel really lucky in the relationship that I have with my co-facilitator. And we've been working well together. Neither of us kind of feels like we're stepping on the other person's toes. And so it's worked out pretty well. And I can't really imagine what that would be like in a different situation now.
Again, that's another really good question, and I don't have much to say about it because I'm not co-leading online, but maybe at some point I'd have. And I'll quickly note too, I love Josh and Shemika, you were asking kind of about next steps, and just noticing that like Wendy Freeman popped on to ask a question, and the fact that she's here and many other names, I think a lot of wonderful knowledge of people in this room. And so yeah, that curiosity of what might be a next step, and then thinking too about Vinny, some of the support groups you've been doing, some of the other things that are already available for people. So that's where my mind is at in our last couple minutes.
I think there's a lot of great voices in this Zoom, and I think they would be great panel leaders and members. I mean, we ought to do this, what? I think we ought to do it again. We ought to march through some topics. To have this many people is powerful.
Yeah, and we've been running the college counseling special interest group of AGPA has been running drop-in consultation groups for the last month and a half, 2 months, basically since the middle of March, where I know a lot of people have come to consult about their admin, clinical issues, these training issues, all these things that we're kind of talking about today. So I hope that you'll continue to use that as a resource if you've already used it, or if you found this helpful. This could be a really great way to continue dialogue in a smaller space where you can share your voice and camera and have that space to empathize with your fellow group aficionados.
So, Josh, I'm sorry, I've interrupted you. I was going to say closing comments since we're in the last minute. So I will send everybody who registered an email with the link to our college counseling SIG shared folder that has a bunch of different resources. And I'll also, in the same email, we'll send you a link to feedback survey for this session. Let's see, there's something else. Oh, the recording will be posted on YouTube. So once that's out, I will also share that link with everybody. Let's see, am I forgetting anything? If you feel like you want to do a panel in the future on a topic of groups online with college students, please let me know. Email me. We likely to we'll put something together again since this has been so popular. And huge thanks to panelists who've been here today, and huge thanks to all of you who've come and joined us for this discussion panel.
And thank you, Kseniya and Vinny, for moderating the discussion as well.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much.
It's nice to see this many people really interested in what I consider to be the most important work. So I mean, this is just fabulous. Thank you for pulling this together.
All right. Have a great evening, everybody. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.